Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my favorite books of 2020. But let's just get right into this. I do have an absolute favorite of the year. And I will save that for the last, though I am sure if you've watched my channel this year, you know what that book will be. So let's just get right into my list here. And like I said, these are in no particular order. First on my favorites list that I want to discuss is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And this was a reread for me back in May. I had read Wolf Hall before and I thought it was good. And I could see why people were talking about it. But when I read it this time, I was truly, utterly, truly blown away by it. And it instantly moved up from just a 4-star read to a 5-star read for me. I did continue on and finish out the Thomas Cromwell series this year, so I read Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light later on in the year. And I have to say, of the three, Wolf Hall is still my favorite. I do think The Mirror and the Light was a really wonderful wrap up to the series, though I felt like it dragged a little bit. I did feel as though that book was too long. And Bring Up the Bodies, weirdly enough, I felt like was too short. But Wolf Hall was just the perfect length, and I really enjoyed this book in a way I did not expect to. The Tudors are not my favorite. I know, shocker. I'm not all that into Henry VIII or the wives of Henry VIII. That's never been my favorite time period because I am a little bit into the time period right before them. The Wars of the Roses is really my sweet spot, and I just generally prefer medieval history to kind of this early modern Tudor history. And so I'm really shocked I took to Wolf Hall in the way that I did. This is a stunningly written book, and you come away from this series genuinely feeling as though you've gotten everything wrong, and that what Hilary Mantel has told you in this historical fiction series is the actual truth. You have gotten it wrong over the years. Everything else you've heard, all the historians you've listened to, they're wrong. Hilary Mantel has it right. And I think that's the mark of an extremely talented writer. And Thomas Cromwell is not the only one who gets a real rehabilitation of character here, though he's certainly the main one. But I found myself very attracted to the figure of the eventual Mary I, Mary Tudor, or she's sometimes termed Bloody Mary. I think this series does a wonderful job at building her as a historical figure and allowing you to see into her mind and understand maybe why she would eventually go on to do the things that she would do. And I also found myself very attracted to Henry VIII. And I think Henry VIII is frequently left out of Tudor discussions, weirdly enough. I think most of the conversation revolves around his wives or around his counselors, like Thomas Cromwell. And I think there are many reasons for that, because generally everyone he was surrounded by was also a very interesting historical figure. But Henry is often left out, and so I have felt in the past, I've kind of questioned why anybody would want to be with him, would want to pursue him, would even want to pretend to be his friend, aside from the fact that he was, just a king. And so you would want to be on his side, to be in his favor. But I think Wolf Hall, in the small glimpses it shows Henry, shows him as a very charismatic and just a genuinely charming guy, somebody who you would have grown up liking. And I think that's a really important characterization for Henry VIII, because he's not necessarily in this series anyway, and particularly in Wolf Hall, he's not necessarily a villain. He's not necessarily the bad guy. He certainly makes these decisions that you have a difficult time rationalizing. But you also really genuinely like him as a person. So I just find Hilary Mantel to be an incredibly talented writer. I will say, if you have held off on picking this up because you've heard a lot about the writing style and you're not all that big a fan of a poetic writing style, of a really detail-oriented writing style, you probably will not like Wolf Hall, and you definitely won't like the sequels. And I would also say this is not the place to start with the Tudors. It's not even really the place to start with Thomas Cromwell, in my opinion, because she drops you in and fully expects you to understand what she's making reference to. And it's fun. It's really fun to be able to kind of stop and Google something, but I know that that's very jarring for the reading experience for a lot of people. So that's something to keep in mind, but Wolf Hall was a definite standout for me this year. As you all probably know, if you have been following my channel for the past few months, 2020 wound up being the year of the romantic movement for me. And so I've tried to limit myself in general with my stack to only 2 things from each genre. And so I only have 2 kind of romantic works on the list. But this is my favorite. This is probably my second favorite work of the year. And it is Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Lord Byron. I am genuinely obsessed with this. I would get a tattoo of certain lines from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, if that tells you anything. It is that beautiful. And Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is an epic poem that's basically following a character called Harold, who bears a fairly strong resemblance to Lord Byron himself, though Lord Byron frequently denies in his notes that Harold has anything to do with him. But Harold goes on kind of a European tour. He visits a lot of different places. But what cemented this for me was just all of the conversation around history, the history of the places that Lord Byron visited. So in particular, what really got me is there are 4 cantos to Childe Harold. The 4th canto is almost entirely about Italy. And it is so beautiful. It is so beautiful. I mean, just the way he writes, you genuinely feel as if you were there looking at the stuff with him. And it's a really wonderful talent for a poet to have, because I often don't feel as though I can visualize poetry or understand it in the way that I would like to. Epic poetry is different for me. I really enjoy epic poetry because it does feel a little bit more stylized and story-like. And Childe Harold has kind of a plot, but Canto 4 is really more about Lord Byron making observations about Italy. And there is another canto that focuses quite a bit on Greece, one that focuses quite a bit on Spain, and they're just really, really beautiful. Perhaps my favorite part of this is when he is in Florence and he kind of slams Florence for losing Dante, for exiling Dante, and thus they will never even get his bones back, which is really, really great. I feel like Lord Byron and I had a mind meld when reading Childe Harold. I felt like literally he reached forward 2 centuries into my own mind and just wrote something perfect for me. It's genuinely amazing how wonderful and how personal Childe Harold became to me. I almost want to put this in my top 3 favorites of all time in terms of epic poetry, which is scary because then I would have to displace things like Paradise Lost. I just genuinely adore this, and it's also now a favorite of all time. So I definitely recommend this. I think if you like poetry, you will really like Lord Byron. I was genuinely shocked to find how much I have loved Lord Byron this year because I fully expected to stick with Shelley. I fully expected Percy Shelley to remain my favorite of the romantic poets, but sadly no. My favorite romantic poet is currently Lord Byron. A recent read that became one of my favorites of the year is The Eternal City by Jessica Maier, which is a history of Rome through maps of the city. I just found this to be a really fascinating nonfiction work. And I think if you are somebody who really loves the city of Rome, loves the history of the city of Rome, this is a wonderful book to pick up. And also if you love maps. I mean, don't we all just love a map? But this book is really interesting in that each chapter, it talks about a specific time period in Rome's history, and it shows maps that were made during that time period, maybe made a little after that time period, and then made in the modern day. And so you can really see how not only the city itself has changed, but how perceptions of Rome have changed over the centuries. It's a genuinely fascinating work, and I have already found myself returning to it to look at certain images. It's a really wonderful illustrated book, as you might can imagine, with gorgeous, gorgeous maps and artwork. And there is, of course, plenty of room in the margins to make notes if you are that type of person. I kind of am. I found myself writing on Post-it notes and sticking them in the margins. This is one that I really, really enjoyed, and I also highly recommend. Keeping on the Italian theme, which apparently was the theme for the year, as I think I have at least one other thing that is Italian themed on this list. But I wanted to talk about The Birth of Venus by Sarah Dunant. Sarah Dunant also wrote Blood and Beauty, which I also read this year, and it is a book on the Borgias that I have to say is probably my favorite Borgia historical fiction I have ever read. So I told myself I could only put one book by her on this list, and shockingly I wanted to put The Birth of Venus and not her Borgia book, which is one of my favorite historical fictions of all time. This is another that became one of my favorite historical fictions of all time, and The Birth of Venus follows a girl in Florence during the reign of Savonarola, and so the Bonfire of the Vanities. And I went into this expecting a romance between kind of a Renaissance artist and his muse, and that's certainly present in part of the book. But it is not at all what the book is about. The book is about our main character finding herself and really growing as a person, growing into adulthood. And I just found it a really, really wonderful read. I burned through it in a couple of days, which I have to say is increasingly more rare for me to do. It's very rare that I read a book that I just want to sit down and read in a couple of days anymore. And with this book, I had that experience. I just could not put it down. This is a book that takes place in one of my favorite time periods in one of my favorite cities. So there was a lot about it that just personally really worked well for me. And I also, of course, highly recommend this. If you are somebody who is into historical fiction and you're tired of the same old time periods, I really highly recommend Sarah Dunant. I just found that this was such a wonderful character study of our main character, Alessandra. And I found myself thinking about her fairly frequently in the months after finishing this. And I read this towards the very beginning of the year. I believe I actually read this in January. So this was definitely one of my favorite historical fictions of the year. One of my favorite fantasies was Fireborne by Rosaria Munda. And I also have found myself returning to these characters into this world frequently in the months since finishing this. And this is a YA fantasy about dragon riders. But it's about so much more than that. This is a very rich political fantasy set in kind of a Romanesque world, and it's post a revolution, akin to maybe the French or Russian Revolution, because one of our main characters is the surviving heir to the previous ruling family. Nobody knows, of course, that he is the heir to this ruling family, but it feels a little bit like Anastasia in that way, but I would say the politics of everything resemble more of the French Revolution. And so what this book really analyzes is whether or not the government that you construct after a revolution is just as bad as the one that you took down. And I think that's a really important story and an important narrative, and it's just so wonderfully rich in terms of character. The heir to the previous ruling family, of course, grows up with a lot of entitlement and a lot of anger and still kind of feels as though he's owed things. But his best friend is a girl whose family, his family killed. And he kind of grows up knowing that and knowing the hardship that she's dealt with. And so there's just a really rich dynamic between them as characters as they find out about each other's pasts, as they kind of forgive each other for what's going on. It feels a little bit like friends to lovers, but also friends to enemies. It's so rich and so wonderful. And it's also got some real shades of Virgil's Aeneid in it. And they frequently read a poem in this book that very clearly echoes the Aeneid, is kind of the Aeneid of this world's Roman Empire. I just genuinely loved this. This was one that took me completely by surprise. I absolutely had no idea that I was going to love it as much as I did. And I really am glad that I decided to pick it up when I did. It got me out of a really bad reading slump. And I am so looking forward to the sequel coming out in 2021. One of my favorite classics of the year, surprisingly, was Armadale by Wilkie Collins. And you might think, why am I saying surprisingly when Wilkie Collins is my favorite Victorian writer? And the reasoning for that is I have just heard so many mixed things about Armadale over the years, and that it frequently falls short in comparison to some of Wilkie Collins's more popular works, so like The Woman in White or The Moonstone. And I have felt bad that I read The Woman in White and The Moonstone first, and now it feels as though I'm going into his backlog and feeling like everything is going to be a disappointment compared to those two. I also read No Name a couple of weeks before I read this, and I thought No Name was good, but I said, you know what, maybe everybody's right. Maybe The Woman in White and The Moonstone really are the best that Wilkie Collins has. But I picked up Armadale, and I am so glad to say The Woman in White and The Moonstone are not only the best he has to offer. Armadale should join their ranks. In fact, I think I like Armadale more than The Moonstone. I just really got into this. I would say don't read the back of this book. Because it does spoil kind of who the villain character is, and I don't think you fully comprehend who that character is until you're about halfway through the book. So I would say definitely steer clear of the description here. But this was very characteristically Wilkie Collins. It's very overdramatic. Things are happening that are so far out of the realm of possibility that you kind of question they're happening at all. But this is just genuinely so much fun. That's the reason why I love Wilkie Collins, is that I just feel like I have a great deal of fun reading him. He really does have a gift with writing page turners. He really does write books that make you want to keep reading and make it difficult to put the book down at night. And I understand the critiques of No Name far more than I understand the critiques of Armadale. I'm genuinely shocked more people aren't discussing Armadale when they talk about Wilkie Collins. It is just so good. It's full of intrigue. It is, of course, a bit of a mystery setup, but it's not as overt a mystery as, say, The Moonstone or The Woman in White. No Name, as well as Armadale, have a little bit more of a subtler mystery and almost feel a little bit more like a modern thriller than a true mystery novel, if that makes any sense. You kind of know what's going on in Armadale, but you dread people figuring it out. It's a really wonderful book. It is quite long, but I don't think it feels long at all. I read this almost all in one day, and so it definitely does not feel as long as it looks. Perhaps my second favorite book of the year is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by B.E. Schwab. And since this book has come out, I have seen a lot of mixed opinions about it. And when I was reading it, I fully understood that most people were going to have a mixed reception to this. There is a very particular audience for this book, and I don't know that it is V.E. Schwab's regular audience. This book is not nearly as action-packed as a typical Victoria Schwab book, and I would also say it really is not as plot-driven as a lot of her books tend to be. This book is a character study of a character that is, by design, a little bit forgettable. And so walking away from this book, Addie herself doesn't really stick with me, but the concepts that the book was playing with have, if that makes any sense. So this book does surround a girl who makes a deal with a devil-like character to live forever, but he curses her to be forgotten by everyone she meets. And so I think by design, Addie is a little bit forgettable as a character. And so the novel surrounds her trying to make her mark, trying to kind of spite this devil-like creature. And I just genuinely loved it. I loved the conversation around art. I loved the conversation around ideas, because this book really allows Addie as somebody who you forget about the second that she leaves your sight, the second that she's out of the room, you don't remember her. But it allows her to make her mark on art, on artists, musicians, and it plays with a really beautiful idea, I think, that no idea comes from one person, that you're always, you know, seeking inspiration from other things. You're always pulling from things and people around you when you're creating something as an artist. And I think that that's a really poignant message. I also think this book plays with the fact that we're all probably going to be forgotten, you know? And so what is it about us that people will latch onto, that people will remember? I just think it's a really beautiful book, and it reminds me very much of the Romantic movement. You knew I was going to go here, but it reminds me very much of things like something that Mary Shelley would have appreciated, or even Lord Byron or Percy Shelley, where writing is a little bit more about the concept and about the message than it is necessarily about the plot or the characters, because I've seen that leveled against several of Mary Shelley's later works, and I understand it. I understand it totally, but if I like those concepts, if I appreciate those concepts and those ideas, I'm far more forgiving with the work, and I think that's probably what happened with me here, is that what she was playing with was something that I really, really respond to. I personally feel like this is the work of V.E. Schwab's that will stand the test of time. And maybe I'm giving it a little bit of early praise, because it certainly seems as though now that the months have moved on, that I'm the odd man out here, that I really loved it, and a lot of other people have found it boring or have found it tedious. But I genuinely love everything about this book. This is truly a haunting work, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since I put it down. Speaking of the romantics and romantic concepts, we have Valpurga by Mary Shelley. This is one that genuinely shocked me. I had a good feeling about it, but I am so pleased to say that I rated this 5 stars. So this is Mary Shelley's historical fiction about medieval Italy, and it follows the life of a real historical figure called Castruccio Castracani. And he was a little bit of a Byronic hero in this book, but he was apparently a figure that was semi-maligned in his own day. He was a little bit villainous, but he's also been viewed as a hero by certain people in Lucca, in the city that he's from. And so I just really enjoyed this because, again, it played with some really interesting concepts. Castruccio feels a little bit like the only character in this narrative, though there are 2 female characters who are also really, really wonderful. He feels as though he is the only character who gets a great backstory, some real development, because he definitely goes through a big change in the novel. But I really also appreciated the female characters in this. A love triangle does form between the 2 of them and Castruccio, and you would think that being 2 women and a love triangle in a classic book, a book written in the 1800s, that there would be some cattiness, that there would be some hatred between the 2 of them, and there was not. There was actually a lot of respect between them as women, and I just really genuinely appreciated it. And one of the women, maybe both of the women actually, were fictional constructs, but one definitely was. And at the end of this book, she says, "Oh, I found this woman's record of events, and thus I am telling her story the way that she would have wanted it to be told," which is an idea that I really, really like, and it was an idea that the Romantics liked playing with, which is kind of the right idea of history, how to tell history, whether or not the real story is harmful in some way, and so should you make adjustments to history when you tell a fictional version of it? And I really, really enjoyed how Mary Shelley did that here. This is also very strong on concept rather than necessarily on plot, though she put a lot of research into this that I really, really appreciate. I don't think this book will work for everybody. This is not really one I recommend, because I definitely see why people would have problems with Valpurga. If you are not into the extreme minutiae of Tuscan Italian politics in the 1300s, this might not work for you, but I kind of really like that. That's a little bit of a sweet spot for me because it's around the time when Dante was living, so I knew a little bit about that before going into this, and I definitely think that helped me. To be frank, I think I like this a little bit more than Frankenstein. I know, I do need to reread Frankenstein, but right now this has my heart a little bit more than Frankenstein does. Another of my favorite fantasies of the year was Crown of Feathers by Nicki Preto. I really, really enjoyed this series. I read the first 2 books of it this year. The 3rd is coming out next year, and I am so, so ready for it. But this is about Phoenix Riders and a girl disguising herself as a boy to get in with those Phoenix Riders. And this is actually, in some ways, rather similar to Fireborn in that this is after a bit of a political upheaval in this world, and the events of the past are very much tied into the present, which you might can guess given that the book surrounds phoenixes and phoenix riders. The past has a really large presence in this future. This has some really rich world building, and I'm always into a fantasy where the past is so rich, and I always really enjoy stories like that. I think that's why Game of Thrones took to me back when I first started reading it, was that I loved being fascinated by how rich the world was and how immense the past was. And that's definitely how this feels. This is a YA series, but I definitely say it has crossover appeal because it is so rich in world building and because it is so rich in kind of political background and political machinations. I would say this is a great book to bridge you over into adult fantasy from YA, or if you are somebody who's into adult and doesn't feel as though YA is rich enough for you, this series definitely is. But the reason that I really love this series and that it's stuck with me is the characters. It's very rare that you read a book and you like everyone in it. You just genuinely like all of the characters, even the villains. And that's this series for me. I think for the most part, other than the villains, this series has a lot of characters with really good hearts, you know, really genuinely good people trying their best and accepting the fact that they are going to have responsibility thrust on them, that they are going to have to make tough decisions, and those decisions are extremely tough for them to make. I will say, I do think the series has some slow points. The second book is much slower than this one, which is why the first is on my favorites of the year and not the second. I really love this. I highly recommend it if you have been looking for a new fantasy series. It is just so rich and the characters are really wonderful. Okay, drum roll please. We are on to my favorite of the year. This is the last book I will talk about, and it is my absolute favorite book that I read this year. And you know what it is. It was Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. This is a dual biography of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley, and I don't think that I need to say very much about it. I'm very pleased to hear that many of you decided to pick this up when I recommended it back in June. And I've heard from so many people that they really were blown away by these women's lives and are genuinely fascinated to learn more and to read more by Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. And that's absolutely the experience I had. This is truly a page turner. This was a book I didn't stop reading until 1 o'clock in the morning one night. And it's very rare for nonfiction to capture me like that, for nonfiction to feel as breathtaking and energetic and action-packed as something that is fictional. But this book did that really well. And it also alternated chapters between Mary Wollstonecraft and her daughter Mary Shelley. And somehow you were engaged with every chapter. You never really felt like when you finished one chapter that you dreaded hearing about the next person, that you really just wanted to stay with one person's story. I did read this for Mary Shelley, and so there did reach a point in Mary Wollstonecraft's story after she went to the French Revolution where I was really eager to get back to Mary Shelley and spend more time with Mary Shelley. But I've heard from several people that they had the opposite experience to me and really wanted to get back to Mary Wollstonecraft rather than Mary Shelley. So this is just a really wonderful nonfiction that I highly recommend. It has genuinely changed my reading life. Without this book, I would not be sitting here today telling you that Lord Byron was a favorite or another book of Mary Shelley's, because I have always felt a real kindred spirit with Mary Shelley. I have always really genuinely appreciated her as a person long before I picked up Frankenstein, but I was shocked at how little I truly knew about her personal life. Genuinely, this book is so shocking. If it was a fiction book, it would not have gotten published. People would have said, this is too much. This doesn't make sense. There is way too much going on, and it would never happen. Nothing like this would ever happen. It would definitely not get published as a fiction book. And so I am genuinely blown away by these women's lives, but Mary Shelley in particular means the absolute world to me. I love Mary Shelley. She is one of my favorite historical figures now, and she is potentially my favorite author. If you've ever been curious to know more about Mary Shelley or Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, and you should be, I highly encourage you to pick this book up. It will genuinely blow you away to see what these women's lives were like, to see the people they came into contact with, to see kind of how they have impacted society and impacted pop culture in ways that you would never have imagined. It's a genuinely moving book. I felt like I was losing a friend when I was done with it, and I very well may reread it again soon. So Romantic Outlaws was definitely my favorite book of the year. So those were all of my favorites of 2020. I tried to narrow myself down and allow myself only 2 books from each genre, and I think I did pretty well there. But I would love to know if you have read any of these, if any of these are on your favorites list, and I would love to know just what is on your favorites list of 2020. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.